Is Ukraine set to surrender? Getting rumblings this morning from press reports that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, on a trip to South America, has floated the idea of peace talks in Switzerland. All of this comes as he's heading to Washington, D.C. What will those meetings portend? More money or actual legitimate surrender and peace talks? Here to navigate these stories that have just unfolded over the past few hours is former U.S. Marine, former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter, who's watching all of this closely. Scott, good to see you.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
So what do you make of this? It seems kind of like a bombshell report. Zelensky sort of drops this as an aside that, in Davos, Switzerland, alongside the World Economic Forum meetings, there's going to be some peace talks. They're going to come to the table and have some peace talks. You've been saying all along there's not going to be any sort of peace talks. It would be an unconditional surrender, if anything. Is he setting the table here for something?
No, this is just part of Zelensky's delusion and decline. First of all, the peace talks he's talking about are premised on his 10-point peace formula that he's put forward that says there can't be peace until Russia withdraws from all territories. In effect, Russia surrenders, turns its leadership over to the International Criminal Court, pays reparations. So it's fantasy, pure, unadulterated fantasy. What he's doing is linking the prospects of these peace talks with the provision of more military aid. For instance, I think this story broke based upon his discussion with the Swiss parliament and leadership via a video call. At the same time, he said, I need Switzerland to permit the re-exportation of Swiss military equipment to the Ukrainian army, you see, because we can only have peace through a Ukrainian victory. So you must continue supply. So this is Zelensky in a desperate bid to get the international community to continue funding his losing conflict with Russia. The peace he's talking about, of course, isn't peace. It's premised on more war, because in order to achieve what Zelensky claims must be achieved before peace can break out, Ukraine must strategically defeat Russia. It isn't happening. So now we come to the second part of your question. What do you do with a leader who's so delusional? Because clearly, even if the United States were able to break the gridlock in Washington, D.C. now about Ukrainian funding, there's not enough money in the world to reverse what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. Ukraine has strategically been defeated. Their military has admitted we've gone over to the defensive. There's no longer a talk about a counteroffensive. Even Ukraine's closest allies are saying, we don't see Ukraine being able to resume the counteroffensive until 2025, which means at best, 2024 will be Ukraine on its back feet, defending against a Russian military that is victorious everywhere, is making strident gains, and to be honest, is on the verge of destroying the cohesiveness of the Ukrainian military, meaning that there won't be a front line to defend much longer. Zelensky is so far removed from reality that he has actually become a danger to the international community, which is why you're seeing increasingly discussions about replacing Zelensky. And I think that's the real story, is that Zelensky is history. He's gone, he's finished. We're just marking the time until that has been accomplished.
It's so bizarre because he's going to be in Washington. He's meeting with President Biden. He's also going to be meeting with the new House Speaker, the new Republican House Speaker, who, by the way, seems all in. We thought we were going to get a House Speaker who was going to put his foot down on Ukraine funding. And no, it seems like we're going back to the same well again on the House Republican side. But this new Sputnik report this morning saying that the West is mulling toppling Zelensky and has a list of successors, according to the Russian Foreign Intelligence, a list of successors, hand-picked successors. So Zelensky's going to be in Washington while movements are being made behind the scenes to remove him. I mean, what do you think this meeting in Washington is all about? Him asking for more money? Or it's It's sort of like a resignation meeting.
Well, I don't believe it's a resignation meeting. Joe Biden has gone all in on the notion that the United States cannot back away from its support of Ukraine, to the extent where he, his Secretary of State, and his Secretary of Defense have all articulated that if the U.S. Congress doesn't fund Ukraine and Ukraine loses this war, as it appears to be doing, that this will lead to a scenario where American troops are fighting Russian troops in Europe, that the best way to avoid that is to continue funding the Ukrainian conflict, sort of a new spin on the old adage that we used during the global war on terror. We have to fight them over there to keep us from fighting them here at home. It's moronic. It's stupid. It doesn't, it doesn't lend itself to any aspect of reality, but that's the slogan. And so, having gone in on that, I think Biden is going to bring Zelensky to Washington in an effort to break the impasse in Congress. But, and even with Johnson, this new speaker articulating in support of Ukraine, there's the big domestic political question. What about the southern border? What about the funding of the wall? Because the Republicans have dug in. They're not going to approve funding for Ukraine unless Biden approves funding for the border wall. And right now, Biden, by inviting Zelensky, it doesn't appear that Biden is seeking compromise. He's seeking to bully, to coerce, to cajole the Republicans into continuing support. But who is Zelensky? He's not the man he was last year. He certainly isn't Time Magazine's Man of the Year. He's a failed politician, a failed leader of a failed country who is suffering the consequences of a failed counteroffensive that cost the collective West hundreds of billions of dollars and cost Ukraine hundreds of thousands of lives.
Over the past week, we've seen a number of media reports. It seems like they're all on the same White House talking points about Ukraine, that Ukraine's losing, but here we really need to step up the amount of military aid that's going there, because if we don't, then Americans will have to shed blood over there. It looks like UK forces will have to shed blood over there, and Putin, left unmatched, will move and march and conquer most of Europe. He'll take over all of Ukraine, and he'll keep marching, and he'll take over all of Europe. Putin's a madman. So that's the message they're going with, and it seems that the Western media is falling right into line with this narrative.
No, it's unfortunate, but if they would just put on their qualitative thinking hats, I know that's difficult to do when we're speaking of the Western media, because they're little more than stenographers of whatever policies coming out of Washington, D.C., NATO, or the European Union. But reality has to, at some point in time, attach itself to policy. Russia right now is winning a war against Ukraine that has not been easy for Russia. It's required the total mobilization or near total mobilization of Russia's defense industry. It's required Russia to sacrifice tens of thousands of lives. And even as we speak, this victory has yet to manifest itself in Russia's reacquisition of Russian territory. That is the territory that Russia annexed last year that continues to be occupied by Ukraine. At best, Russia would be able to regain these territories and perhaps extend Russian control over additional adjacent territories. But that's the maximum extent that this Russian military can advance into Ukraine. This Russian military, as it currently exists, cannot seize all of Ukraine if there is resistance. It lacks the capacity to do so. It's not large enough to do so. So this notion that Russia is seeking to steamroller over Europe, to extend the fight into Poland, to extend the fight into the Baltics, is ludicrous, is absurd, is obscene. Russia's not doing that. Russia is simply seeking to assert the national security prerogatives that it set out in December of 2021, that Ukraine cannot be a part of NATO, and that Russia cannot tolerate this pro-Western, pro-NATO entity, this cancer living next door. But Russia wants to live in peace with Ukraine, a neutral Ukraine. That's the limit of Russia's ambition. That's it. Vladimir Putin has not articulated anything other than that. And the reality is the Russian military isn't positioned to do anything other than that. Any military expert will tell you, based upon the correlation of forces as they exist, Russia is not capable at this juncture of continuing an offensive operation against Poland or the Baltics. It is capable of defending Russia against any incursion by the newly expanded NATO, inclusive of Finland, potentially Sweden. But Russia is not positioned to carry out ongoing offensive operations. That's a military reality, but it's also backed by the political reality that there is nothing about what Russia has done that appears to be posturing in that direction. So this is fear mongering of the most base kind by the Biden administration, by NATO. Fear mongering that says if we don't continue to sacrifice Ukraine on the altar of NATO relevance, woe be us, the world will come to an end. No, the world won't come to an end. Russia is not the enemy that the West is painting it to be. Russia simply wants to live in peace with its neighbors. It wasn't Russia that picked the fight in Ukraine. It was the West. It wasn't Russia that turned its back on peace. It was the West. Russia will now finish this conflict on terms that are acceptable to Russia. There will be peace in Ukraine eventually, Clayton, but it'll be a peace dictated by Russia at a table of surrender. It won't be a peace that comes from some sort of fantasy world crafted by Zelensky and his Western supporters.
And what is true, of course, is that Ukrainian soldiers are massively underarmed. There are freezing conditions, of course, and their military is being slaughtered and decimated. We know from the Ukrainian side that they're looking to up the amount of conscription, get as many people as they can. They've, of course, altered the military age, extending the age at which you can join. I think in the United States, you can't even join the military if you're over 44. There, I think it's now pushed up to 60. They're trying to expand it because an entire generation of young people has been entirely wiped out. So they're getting incredibly desperate right now. And as you look at this Sputnik report about a list of successors to Zelensky that the West would mull putting in place, would it be someone like a Zelensky or somebody who has some sort of an appetite to try to launch some sort of larger counteroffensive, even though it seems like it'd be impossible? Or is it somebody who is going to be sitting on a defensive posture? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on who the West would try to push in Zelensky's place.
Well, it's clear that the West has bought into a narrative that says that the conflict, best case scenario, will become a frozen conflict. And so they need a leader that will accept this temporary political setback of a frozen conflict, until which time Ukraine can join NATO, can join the European Union, can turn things around. And then at some point in the future, undesignated, the collective West will back Ukraine's endeavors to reconquest its lost territory. So that's the Western scenario. Now, the Russians are looking at it and saying, why would we ever even participate in something? And they're not going to. So again, the West is in this self deceiving process of pretending that they're relevant. Clayton, I don't know how to make this any more clear. When the fighting stops in Ukraine, and it will stop, it'll be done because Russia has determined it's time to stop. And Russia will determine the conditions which facilitate, determining that time. Russia alone, by itself, with no input from the West, will make these decisions because the West, Clayton, has been defeated by Russia. Why would Russia ever allow a defeated entity to negotiate and demand the terms of conflict termination? They would never allow that.
Right.
This is like, the United States, saying at the end of, the World War II, hey, Germany, how do you think this should end, pal? What do you want? You want to keep part of France?
Right.
What the hell? I mean, a little bit of Russia, some of the Balkans. Nazis, it's okay. Hitler, you want to stay, Hitler? You can stay. We just want this war over. No, unconditional surrender is unconditional surrender, and that's the only thing Ukraine's going to get out of this.
I want to get you out of here on this, Scott. Your expertise in bioweapons and weapons of mass destruction. Since the very beginning of this, I've been fascinated by the Bioweapons Labs in Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, of course, under oath, admitted to it, even after they first lied about there being bioweapons facilities, biolabs in Ukraine funded by the United States. We know the Hunter Biden connection to all of this. And we've long been wondering, and of course, Russia has been pointing out, saying, look, we know that there are major trouble with Russia's radiological, chemical, and biological defense troops. They've said a number of times that the U.S. military and biological activities in Ukraine, deliberate infections of Ukrainian servicemen with deadly viruses, testing on these individuals. And now we have a report from the CDC last week talking about the antimicrobial resistance seen now spiking in Ukraine. This is from the Centers for Disease Control on their own website. This is not a conspiracy theory. The CDC is now saying that they're seeing this spike. Could this be from these biolabs? I guess the question is, there's been no real reporting on what's been happening to these labs since the war has really unfolded. We've seen documents being burned and other things. But what's your assessment? In your experience, what's happened to these labs? Have they been cleaned out? And should we be concerned that there are some sort of major problems, as reports are suggesting, that these antimicrobial resistance have born right out of these labs? What's your assessment of this?
Well, first of all, these labs are sort of they're linked to a Cold War era program, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, run by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, to take under control Soviet-era bioweapons labs that had been inherited by the Ukrainian government. Then these labs became an employment vehicle. This program became an employment vehicle for Ukrainian biologists who. It wasn't just about taking control and shutting down these labs, but how to keep these biologists who were involved in producing some of the world's deadliest pathogens, keep them employed so they don't go elsewhere. And then you turn it over to contractors who are seeking to come up with viable projects for these scientists to do. In the U.S. bioweapons world, we, of course, are a signatory to the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention. It has very loose compliance, mechanisms, but we are committed to it. And there's evidence that we're serious about being committed. To give you an example, when the Soviet Union fell, we gained access to some of the blueprints and diagrams of advanced Soviet bioweapons, including cluster munitions that were used to disperse bioagents. And the CIA, when they got the documents, sought to reverse engineer these and produce them so they could better evaluate the efficacy of the weapons system. And the U.S. government, the experts, looked at what the CIA was doing and said that is a violation, a technical violation of the Biological Toxin and Weapons Convention. And so pressure was put on the CIA to terminate that program. And this was done in secrecy, meaning it wasn't public pressure. This was an internal review. So the reason why I bring that up is that we are not inclined to operate in violation of a treaty. What we do, however, is take it right up to the edge. And on biological weapons, and I know this personally because I was a hazmat technician trained to federal standards to respond to chemical, biological, and nuclear things. And I've been to all the federal training courses there are on this. When we speak of biological weapons, we speak in American terms of defensive capacity. But you can't have a defensive capacity unless you test to protect against potential offensive weapons. So part of our defensive capacity is to produce on a pilot scale, on very small scale levels, different pathogens, dry powdered anthrax, for instance. The dry powdered anthrax that was used in the October 2001 envelope attack was produced by the United States government as part of this program. And we do the same thing. There are limitations, however, to what can be done legally in the United States. So now we have these biolabs in Ukraine and in Georgia and elsewhere. And we have defense contractors who have been told there's a lot of money available to pursue these programs. And so they put in, together with industry, et cetera, these programs that are couched as defensive in nature, but are really about developing offensive capabilities. But they claim that the offensive capabilities are only done so we can learn how to protect ourselves against them, that we have to project what a potential enemy can do so we can better prepare for it. But that's just mumbo jumbo, because at the end of the day, the offensive capabilities that we're producing violate the Biological Toxin and Weapons Convention. We just fool ourselves into believing they don't because we say it's really about defensive. So ignore the fact that it's really an offensive program. It's only fake offensive to make ourselves stronger defensively. I think this is what happened. I think this was a project absolutely out of control, where money was being poured into Ukraine and people were being allowed to put up any harebrained scheme and run with it. And the Ukrainians have such lax regulatory oversight that things can happen in Ukraine that can't happen in the United States, such as infecting servicemen, working with the mentally ill, things that, again, when you look at it in isolation, you say, this is insane what they're doing, insane. But if you've ever been involved in defense contracting, where all supervision, all compliance control, all regulatory control has been lifted and you leave them to their own devices, this is what you get, Frankenstein's monster.
Who's controlling these labs now? 46 of them. I mean, who has control? Does the United States have security control of it?
I would believe, knowing the way that contracts are done, that we've shut these things down, that we've terminated the funding for these programs, and these programs have been shut down, that they are in the process of being whitewashed, eliminated, boom. And this is another thing that Congress needs to get in a hold of, because we can't just allow this to have occurred and then disappear. The Russians are sitting on a trove of documentation that proves that America was operating in violation of the Biological Toxin Weapons Convention. The Americans will say there was no intent to do so, but as I just outlined, that's just because of a perverse American interpretation of what intent is. The bottom line is we were violating this. It's imperative that Congress, if America is ever going to be taken seriously in the world of multilateral disarmament treaties, such as the Biological Toxin Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, or any other nuclear nonproliferation treaties, that we have a full understanding of what happened, how it happened, why it happened, and that we put in place mechanisms to ensure that it never happens again. Because what we did in Ukraine wasn't just wrong, Clayton, it was a crime.
And yeah, we'll see if anyone's prosecuted on this. Anthony Fauci is still getting to go to Washington Nationals games, by the way. Victoria Nuland still able to be testifying privately in Congress and behind closed doors as some sort of an expert. Scott Ritter, great to see you. Thank you so much for your expertise on this, and really, really fascinating. We appreciate it as always. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.